I'm here today. I was asked to discuss different possible strategies to help mitigate heat against extreme heat and protect your vine health and your berry quality. First, a quick introduction to heat waves. We have been observing that they're increasing in their number per year as well as in their severity and in their duration. We also know that when vines are exposed to temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius, you can start to see an impact on photosynthesis with the disruption of the photosynthetic apparatus and stomatoclosure to conserve water, which can ultimately lead to leaf and water potential and possibly stem water potential decline. And under prolonged exposure to extreme temperatures, you can see reduced vine health and possibly vine death. What does it do to the berry quality? Well, yield losses, we're well aware of this from sunburn, damage, decreased berry weight, dehydration, and desiccation. We are observing increased sugar concentration normally, decreased titratable acidity, and an increase in pH. And in terms of secondary metabolites, the main one, particularly in red grapes, is anthocyanins, which we observe a degradation and a decoupling from total soluble solids. This all ultimately leads to higher alcohol wines with lower acidity, lower balance, and lower color. So I wanted to introduce you to three possible mitigation strategies. First, I'll talk about shade netting. Second, about kaolin particle film. And these two have been in use for several years. And then the research I was involved in Argentina was discovering the effects of an overhead spray water treatment. And these three strategies have one thing, they have more than one thing in common, but one thing that I was focused on was using less water. So shade nets, quickly, what are their properties? They're generally almost entirely made of high-density polyethylene, which is non-toxic and completely recyclable. Shade nets come with a shading factor, which is effectively a percentage of how much light reaches the vines after a net divided by how much light reaches a vine without a net. And this shade factor depends on color, mesh size, and texture. And in the literature, what I saw for mesh size is 1.7 to 7 millimeters for warp or weft length for shade nets, and 2.5 to 8 millimeters for anti-hail, 1.8 to 7 millimeters for windbreaks, or 3 to 4 millimeters for bird. And I wanted to make that note because what you can see quickly is you can actually use one net for multiple purposes. In shade netting, there are two main colors that are used in Italy in particular. There's a third one I won't be discussing though. So black and green, and then white is the one I'm not going to touch on. So black generally is 40, but you can see even higher shading factor. It works in one way. It absorbs light. So either the vines receive light through the holes or the light is absorbed by the opaque black mesh. Colored nets play a little differently. They operate on 3 levels. So they can absorb some of the light, but they also modify the spectral transmittance, and they can increase the diffusion of light. So you can actually get light further into your canopy. And a fourth reason that they're often used, the green nets, is for the aesthetics of it. They just blend into the environment. Shade nets basically alter your microclimate by blocking between 50 and 80% of the spectrum, and ultimately they can reduce your maximum temperature at the canopy level between 1 to 7 degrees Celsius in the research. And they can also increase your relative humidity between about 3 and 10%. So here is, I don't know how to, is that the light? Yeah, okay. So here's an interesting graph showing the transmittance of the colored nets. So you can see that the green nets can diffuse up above 50% of the PAR compared to the black net, which was equivalent to a control, to no net at all. So the black net is just absorbing the light and not diffusing any deeper into the canopy. And this is also showing you the photoselection. So this is a blue net, so it transmits more into the blue end of the spectrum, and a red net, which transmits more into the red and infrared. So it's not most of the literature doesn't show it decreasing temperature. In fact, it will enhance temperature because near infrared is the culprit for increased temperature. And green shifts into the green end of the section with a small blip in the red, which is good for photosynthesis, and then the lowest near infrared. On the bottom, this is a brand new piece of research out by Pelotti et al., and they used anti-hail netting with a shade factor of 15%. This is the mesh size here. And they measured the shade factor at the canopy level, and it came out to about 18%, so slightly higher than the factory rating. But what was also very interesting was they measured at the fruit zone inside the canopy. As I mentioned, the black just absorbs, and it decreased their light exposure down to about 20% to 15%, which can have significant impacts on your photosynthetic activity. So what do the nets do? They reduce the incidence of sunburn and berry shrivel. They can reduce photosynthetic activity, specifically the black nets. And this has been observed to improve vine water status and delay ripening through what they suspect is lower carbon assimilation rates. It has been observed frequently to lower total soluble solids, increase titratable acidity, and decrease pH, typically. However, I caution you because the research suggests that the results for yield vary by region and cultivar, so don't anticipate that if you use a net, you will automatically enhance your yield. And this has been in multiple pieces of research. And interestingly, Gigliano et al. Did a research on Chardonnay and Pinot Noir in the same year in the same vineyard. And they came up with an increase in Chardonnay of 30% and a decrease of 13% in Pinot Noir. And typically, under heat wave conditions, shade netting can enhance your anthocyanins compared to a control and decrease flavanols because they're dependent on UV exposure. Operational considerations, these nets typically last between 5 and 10 years under field conditions, and they will degrade more quickly because of sunlight exposure, contact with objects, pesticides, extreme weather events, and dust accumulation was notable in Israel. They said specifically in dry years, it really reduces the efficacy and they're very hard to clean off. You simply apply them over the bunch zone, so there's minimal infrastructure required compared to some other options, but it can inhibit management practices. Where are some areas for further research? I'm going to repeat myself in every method I introduced today. Research needs to be done to determine the impact on cultivars, specifically as in regards to yield. Excuse me. And there's a new interesting technology coming out, shade films. It's reasonably new. Merigliano just had a paper on this, and its photoselective properties. It's not a net, it's a plastic sheet. And they are using nanotech and infusing these sheets with chemicals that can choose which light penetrates. So in this case, they can block out near infrared while allowing the full photosynthetically active radiation to penetrate. And they appear to may have some good potential as a future strategy. Okay, kaolin particle film, what is it? It's a clay, it's safe, it's inert, and it's abundant. It was initially developed for pest control. So it has shown efficacy against downy mildew, botrytis, and multiple insects in grapevines. And its mode of action is through changing the texture of the leaf and the fruit, as well as it has a very high reflectancy rating with a brightness above 85%. So it increases insect avoidance in that manner. And these two characteristics also work in terms of mitigating against heat because it reflects the spectrum from UV to infrared and can lead to reductions in temperatures of up to 5 degrees. This is Dinnis et al., and they showed at veraison and harvest in 2 years, significant decrease in leaf temperature at the canopy level. But also, similar to colored nets, it diffuses PAR deeper into the canopy, or it has the potential to do that. And this can be combined with the decrease in the canopy temperature can actually amplify photosynthesis, total photosynthesis. So what does kaolin appear to do? It reduces leaf temperature and leaf chlorosis and berry dehydration. Frioni et al. Observed that they lost 30 to 35% of non-treated berries in their experiment for the controls. Reduces sunburn, sugar concentrations, and it improves, as I mentioned, photosynthetic rates, yields, and it increases anthocyanin content as well as organic acids. If you're interested in more information on plant physiological response, Sarah Bernardo was here last year and she presented her research, and it is on the IVES YouTube channel, so you can check that out for more detailed information. Operational considerations. Oh, that's new. Results can change dependent on cultivar and region. Results are pronounced in hot and dry years. I think I should be saying that for all of these. If you're applying shade nets and you don't see a heat wave, you won't see the effects I'm talking about. The Australian Grape and Wine Authority recommends treatment when air is above 40 degrees for 1 day or 35 degrees for at least 2 to 3 days. I think that might be something that needs to be looked at in each region. It might differ because of adaptive traits of the vines. And it's recommended to just apply it to the side of the vines that get the most sun, the most heat, to save you money and time. And if you use that strategy, it's 18 to 20 euros per hectare. I've spoken to producers who say actually it's even cheaper than that. And you pay attention that, of course, rainfall will wash the product off. Future research. Studies to improve adhesion to leaves so that you don't have to reapply as frequently. Determine response by cultivar, so don't just expect the same response in your vineyard because you heard it happen somewhere else. And zeolites are they're not new, but they're starting to do research on these. They're similar but different. What's interesting about them is they have a very high cation exchange capacity, so they can absorb up to 55% of their weight in water and slowly release it. So historically, they've been used as a soil amendment, but they're showing promising results in terms of the physiological response of vines in heat waves. So they might be worth considering more research on. And I just think if you're going to have something wash off into your vineyard, having something that will amend your soil and improve its ability to hold water might be worth your consideration. So finally, this is the research I was involved in Argentina, and it was a VWISE project in the Working Project 1 Vine Adaptation to Climate Change. And these are the partners I worked with. And simply, we had a treatment and a control, and the control were just vines that suffered and had nothing. And the treatment was a targeted overhead pulsed water application that was applied only during daylight hours, during heat waves, which were defined as days that observed a maximum temperature of at least 35 degrees and a minimum temperature of at least 21 degrees. And this water was, I'm doing it again. Sorry. Back. Okay. So this water was pulsed 1 second on, 1 second off for 15 minutes every 30 minutes, as I said, during daylight hours. So this is what happened during the course of the research. We had 2 heat waves. The red is the control and the blue is the treatment. This is the canopy temperature. And very briefly, it became significantly different between the two as soon as we started the treatment at the first heat wave. And it remained significantly different until 5 days after the second heat wave. I'm going to show some results from sample point 4, which was performed in the middle of heat wave 2, and then sample point 5, which was performed 3 days after the end of heat wave 2, so 3 days after the treatment was stopped. This is stem water potential, and you can see here very clearly that a difference is starting to occur during the second heat wave. This is Bonarda. We did it on 3 cultivars, so Bonarda, Malbec, and Syrah. And you can see quickly that the treatment was starting to have a bit higher of a stem water potential, significant in 2 of the cultivars. I don't know what that is. And then 3 days after the heat wave, it was significantly different for all three. And it was more that the control got more negative, was suffering more than the treated was increasing. This is the stomatoconductance. So during heat wave 2, the treatment vines were able to operate more normally, and the control were more or less flatlining during the day. This difference in response allowed the treated vines to decrease their leaf temperature significantly at the hottest point in the day. Then 3 days after the heat wave, we had an interesting response from all varietals where they were operating at highest capacity at 8 a.m. in the morning and then slowly declined. The stomata slowly stopped operating until they reached a not significant difference with the controls, which were flatlined all day. But this did not result in a change in leaf temperature, although, as I mentioned, the canopy temperature was still notably significantly lower. Yields, very quickly, although it wasn't always significant, you can see that in the treated vines, it always trended higher. So we did see a positive response in terms of yield, and it was significantly higher for Syrah and Malbec in terms of bunch weight. We also measured pH, TSS, TPI, and total anthocyanin, and at this higher level, we saw no significant difference at any time point for any cultivar. But when we looked at anthocyanin composition, we did notice that Bonarda was observing differences, suggesting it had increased plasticity compared to the other two cultivars. So keep that in mind if you ever choose to use a strategy like this. Operational considerations. This strategy used about 1/2 liter of water per vine per day compared to a conservative irrigation strategy of 10.6 liters per day per vine. It is currently more suitable for less humid regions due to the possible amplification for risk of diseases. I didn't mention it before, but the equipment that we used for this was actually repurposed. It had been used as frost damage mitigation. So you could actually, if you've got frost damage mitigation equipment in your vineyard, you can use it for two things. And you need to consider if you have access to a clean water source in your vineyards. Further research, response by cultivar, again. How low can we go? This is where I'm curious because we didn't determine the dosage. The way we determined the dosage of water was to just make sure none of it touched the soil, to make sure that the treatment was the water in the leaves. So now my question is, how much less water can we apply to the canopy and still affect a response? And this can also tie into the risk of disease in more humid areas. If you can even reduce the amount of water further, you can reduce the risk of disease and keep a higher VPD, vapor pressure deficit. And I am also curious about the response of adjacent non-treated vines, because if you have the treatment on one vine and you elicit a response in a neighboring vine that doesn't get the treatment, then you again are reducing the amount of water you're applying. So, in conclusion, what I just introduced you to briefly, all of these treatments support vine health during heat waves. All of these treatments protect berry quality during heat waves. All are multi-purpose heat waves and, for nets, anti-hail, anti-bird, wind, kaolin, disease and insect prevention, and overhead water is also anti-frost damage. So I'll draw your attention to this graph here very quickly. This is Patumanu in 2023, and they did research on the efficacy in heat waves, but they also counted the disease. So this is sunburn and necrosis and dehydration. Black is control, red is kaolin, and green is zeolite. This is Peronospora. This is Lobesia botrana, and this is the combined total effect of kaolin or zeolite on the reduction of damage obtained from biotic and abiotic stressors. So you can see that kaolin plays this role quite nicely. And finally, all of these can be used in tandem. So you can use the overhead water with netting. In fact, when we did the research, our treatment had bird netting on it and the control. I've also seen in operation kaolin and nets together. So you can use one or you can use two. maybe not 3, but. And that's it. Merci. Grazie mille. Thank you.